Hi everyone, my name is Suma and I'm here with Marco Masi. He's a physicist based in Germany. And today we are going to talk about quantum physics. Hi Marco.
Hi Suma, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining in today. You have written two books. One is Quantum Physics and one is Free Education.
Hmm.
If you can first share about what was the motivation behind writing these books.
Well, yes, there was a motivation, and there is a line, a silver line that connects them and will also connect the next book. The main motivation is that I think we have to go beyond sort of what I call the rationalistic physicalism. Which is this main unaware background assumption that everything must be reduced to matter, physics, physical laws inside a purely rationalist and analytic understanding of the world. It is this mindset that we have nowadays where everything that I think permeates our society still very strongly. There has been some progress in this sense, but it is this mindset that is called the materialist, physical, and reductionist, deterministic mindset, which regards also reason as the ultimate tool of knowledge, of cognition, of understanding, and the reason of the Enlightenment, and which is a good thing in a certain sense. But I think we have to go beyond that. It's like this carbon-based economy. We produced energy with carbon, with carbon fire power plants, and that they polluted a lot our air and the world. But this had a good side in a certain sense, because it allowed us to advance, to create the industrial civilization, to advance with science, with technology. But now we are realizing that we cannot go ahead always with this same way and the same mentality and mindset in producing energy. Here we have the same thing. This materialistic, reductionist, and deterministic mindset which sees life as a big machine and reduces it only into molecules, neurons, genes, and whatever. And this bottom-up reductionist mindset served us also well. It had a real good impact on the history of humankind. This helped us also to bring forward a progress, a technological and scientific progress. But I think that it has reached its peak, and now we have to see also beyond that way of understanding and looking and seeing reality. What we are now, what we need now badly, I think, is this sense of unity, the sense of unity in the world, and a more spiritual minded and heart-centered life concept of life. And also, generally, we need a rise in consciousness towards a spiritually minded civilization. That's my point of view. And not only mine. I'm not alone, fortunately, in this. You can see what kind of problems this creates in the nowadays science. You can see this in the philosophy of mind, for example. It is exemplified with the so-called mind-body problem, where you see that mind is only an epiphenomenon, sort of fume coming out of our brain, and which is where mind and consciousness is regarded just as byproduct of our neurons, of our biochemical reactions in our brains, and nothing else. Things like the spirit, the soul, the mind itself are just epiphenomenon, an emergent property. They do not really exist other than a complex mechanistic and functional and material interaction between an aggregate of neurons and complicated biochemical reactions. In this view, we are just biological deterministic robots without free will. And who thinks otherwise is hypnotized by an illusion. According to this physicalist point of view, it's a nice fairy tale that we like to tell to ourselves. But we are just robots, nothing else. Still, this is the mindset that we have still today. Most scientists, neuroscientists, and those working, I think, also on AI, well, they don't put it in these terms, perhaps, but deep down, their more or less conscious or unconscious assumption is this identity between mind and brain, mind and body, and it is taken for granted. Modern science doesn't even not think about it much, but we know that modern neuroscience did not, well, modern neuroscience made a lot of progress. With all the brain scan technology, you know, there's these kind of fMRI, EEG, positron emission tomography, and whatever. They have made a lot of progress. And they seem to have given us a scientific boost to the consciousness studies. But would these scientists have honestly pondered about the so-called hard problem of consciousness? I don't know if we're acquainted with this, but it's this idea, this question. Yeah? Why do we have perceptions if we are just robots? Just like the Terminator of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Why do we have feelings? Why do we have qualitative experiences? Why is a subject? Why do these bunch of neurons, well, 100 billions of neurons that we have in our head, why does this give rise to a subjective perception of someone who feels and perceives something? Why are we not just zombies, just robots and nothing else, if this physicalist mindset is true, is correct? And I think if we are honest, if scientists would be honest about that, they would admit that no progress whatsoever has been made in this sense on trying to explain and to come to terms with this problem, despite decades of an enormous technological progress. My contention is that if scientists would learn to go inside, taking a first perspective, a first person perspective, and learning to know themselves better, going beyond a purely rationalistic thinking, they would realize there are hidden metaphysical assumptions with which they are working. Which is this purely rationalistic, physicalistic perspective. But they, unfortunately, most of them are not aware of that. Things are changing. There has been a progress also in this sense. Now, fortunately, there are also philosophers who are going in this direction, and there is an opening. If I remember about 20, 30 years ago, those people who had not a purely materialistic thinking were almost none, or were not considered at all. Nowadays, there is a new stream, and that is realizing that these purely analytic and rationalistic thinking that is unable to go inside and to take a first-person perspective to consciousness, mind, spirituality, and to ourselves. Yeah? That there must change something. So it is from this mindset that I say, let's see if we can understand things better if we take another perspective. A perspective in which, in the case of the book of quantum physics, is that a more idealist point of view, where I say quantum physics tells us something about us more than about the world. And it invites us to know ourselves better, because what quantum physics is telling us is that we see a sort of illusion of the world. And for the education part, for the educational book, then we can go into the details of the book, but just to close, to come to the end, to finish, to answer to your question, in the case of education is here also, let's not take only this perspective of the human brain as just a machine that learns like a computer, but instead let's us take the more spiritualist point of view as a child, for example, but I would say also grown-ups who are souls in progress, and the learning, going to school, learning things are not for finding for a job, but for our soul growth, and to see if things about education turn out to work better if we think education in the sense of a soul-centered education. That is the progress of a soul. That's why I also called it the free progress education.
We have seen two extremes about quantum physics, where one extreme is about the science being like very reductionist and based on physical evidence, but the other extreme is where there are some exaggerated claims about quantum physics, and almost to the extent that there's now stigma attached to quantum physics, that it's kind of like a pseudoscience. What goes on for you when you hear those kind of extreme exaggerations about quantum physics?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. I think we have a problem here. Nowadays, there are these extremes. Again, one extreme is a purely abstract, analytic, mental way of reason to try to understand the world only, after all, on a sense-based and sense-mind understanding. On the other side, we have a lot of people who have an inner calling, who feel inside something and try to understand the world also intuitively. And most of the times a bit messy thing comes out. There are a lot of misunderstandings, especially what concerns quantum physics. There are a lot of pseudoscience out there, so-called quantum woo. And despite my spiritual inclinations, I couldn't come to terms with that, because we must be serious on these things. And that's why I also wrote this book, which is, first of all, very technical. But it is about the foundations of physics. It goes to the philosophic, it tells you, it explains you things in a way, in a very technical way, but yet focuses on the philosophical aspects of quantum physics. And once one learns these foundational technical aspects, then you can build upon it. But you cannot begin to fantasize about quantum theory, talking and theorizing with wild speculations, if you don't have these basics. And that's why I wrote this basic intro, which is about the knowledge of the foundations of quantum physics. It needs a bit of math. It is a sort of intermediate level. It's neither a popular level book, but also not a purely academic book. It needs so a bit high school math. And but I hope that the reader at the end has a baggage, has a background, and an understanding of things that allows him or her to build upon it also something that goes beyond the purely rationalistic understanding of the world. And that's where I ended also the book with a chapter on philosophical idealism, because I think that at the end of the story, what quantum mechanics tells us is that the world as we perceive it is a sort of illusion. This doesn't mean that there is nothing, that there is something, because there is something that gives rise to this illusion. But it has nothing to do with what we perceive. I use frequently this analogy of the Plato's cave. You know, Plato's cave, where you see, what we see are shadows, shadows of a real reality. But when you see the shadow of an object, like of a pen, yeah, you don't see the object itself. You see a shadow of it. And if you mistake this shadow for the object in itself, then you're going into the wrong direction. And that's what I contend is doing modern physics, quantum physics. I mean, the philosophical vein of quantum physics. You can also make quantum physics just calculating. There's this saying, shut up and calculate. And just by calculating, you get every result, and you can measure things according to these calculations. And it works perfectly. But when it comes to the problem, what does this mean? What is the sort of stuff that all these weird and strange paradoxes that we have in quantum mechanics? The non-locality, for example, the entanglement, the randomness, the uncertainty of Heisenberg, and so on. All these things suggest us a world that is a bit weird, isn't it? And if you go to the thing and we are honest with ourselves, what all this is telling us, and it is telling us something about ourselves, not about so much about the world in itself, because we are seeing the shadows. And that's something that usually I think most scientists, physicists are not aware of. They think that these things there exist really. Particles, and then they are exchanging other particles, and then they are run randomly a bit here and there. Also, the notion of space and time itself is very doubtful, and this is turning out also in modern quantum gravity theories, that we have a problem evidently with this concept of space-time. So the problem, the book wanted to raise this problem about our understanding of the world from the perspective of modern quantum physics. And the idea is first learn the basics and then think about it. Yeah. So some readers might be a bit disappointed because they think they will find a lot of nice stories that I will tell, or incredible things, but I give them the foundations of the basics that they need to know first.
One of the foundation basics I would like to know is, like, for example, we hear about these ideas in mainstream, like we are all made of light. Are we really made of light? What is your comment on that?
Yeah. Okay, then see, what is light first of all? Yeah. So we must first of all learn what light is and what differentiates light from matter. At bottom, at the end of the story, what differentiates light from matter is that matter has an inertia. That to move it, you have to kick it, give a kick, and then the particle begins to move, and it accelerated according to the force that I impart to the particle. Whereas for light or photons, you can also imagine that's one of the typical paradoxes, not paradoxes, but the wave-particle duality. You may have heard about that, and that you can also see light as a particle of light. The only difference it is that light goes always with the speed of light. It has always the same speed. It never changes its speed. And this is also true for other particles which are mediators of forces, presumably gravitons, and also the particles which make up our nuclear forces. But I don't go now into the detail. So there is, after all, only difference between light and matter is only in as much that matter is, you can also say, if you wish, physicists, you would not make an examination of physics if you say that, but intuitively we can see matter as a particle of light which somehow does no longer have a speed of light which is equal for every observer and has an inertia. It has a mass. But after all, if you wish, you can reduce everything to particles of matter or of energy, more generally. So maybe the question is not if we are made of light. The question is, what is matter? And what differentiates one particle from the other? We are all made of one substance, probably, at bottom, which presents itself sometimes as light and sometimes as a single particle which moves slower than light. But according to the physics, that's the real difference. From a spiritual standpoint, there one can see that light seems to be something more subtle, more finer. It is something that you don't see here. You see, our understanding of the world is no longer materialistic and reductionistic. Can be a wave, but it is not made of matter. But what is it then? Okay, you can also imagine a water wave, but the point is that light does not have a medium. So what is it? I think at bottom we will see that all this is an expression of a being. If we go inside and intuitively, we will see that light is an expression of a being, light exactly as matter. But here now is more the spiritualist speaking, no longer the scientist. And also according to some spiritual traditions, light is a gross form of the spirit. So saying that we are made of light, yes, but we are made of matter, but both are the appearance of one single thing, which is neither light nor matter, but probably something else, which expresses itself as light and as matter.
Another basic idea I would love your clarity on is about space. Like, what is space? Is space really empty? What is it made up of?
Yeah, you know that we have there's this classical understanding of empty space, which is, well, take a volume, pump out all the gas, the air. Say ideally, technically it would be extremely difficult to do this, but ideally you can imagine that you take out every atom, you put this empty chamber in a refrigerator to 0 absolute degrees, almost absolute 0. So in this sense, we imagine that there is nothing. Empty space is nothing. First of all, I would say already in classical physics, this idea of nothingness is very doubtful. Because at the end, how do we know what is space for us? Can we abstract from the idea of space beyond our subjective experience of things? Can we even imagine space without relating somehow to our senses? I have a bodily sensation that I feel that there is a three-dimensional space. By the way, one of the mysteries of physics is why three-dimension, not 4, 5, 6. So, but okay, that's another issue. So this idea of space is already an image appearing in our mind. It is an understanding of our sensations. It is a figment. It is again a sort of shadow that is projected onto our mind, coming from our sensory experience, because we have sensory experience. So already from that point of view, purely classical point of view, where you have still no quantum mechanics in it, I already would say we should think about this idea of space as a construction in us of something that may well exist out there. I'm not denying that there is an empty space out there, but it is probably something that has nothing to do with our understanding of the world, exactly that, like the shadow of an object. Then, moreover, in quantum mechanics, you have also this idea that in quantum mechanics, real space does not really exist. There is no nothingness. We have, again, this idea of that in every volume of space or point of space-time, it is made of harmonical oscillators. You can, in quantum field theory, you can formalize that, and you can see that the vacuum has a ground state energy, which means that it still has a little bit of energy. And there is this idea, which is again not really correct, but let's go for it, that it is a fluctuating vacuum of energy. And how can this be? One can say, okay, but this is contrary to the principle of conservation of energy, because something there is popping into existent energy, but we know we have been told in school that energy cannot be created and not annihilated. How can there be energy coming into existence? Quantum mechanics tells you, yes, this is true, but it takes extremely short time, something about 10 to the minus 10 or minus 20 seconds. So for billions of a second, there can appear energy, and due to the relation between energy and matter, Einstein's relation, that you can also imagine particles popping in and out of existence continuously in every point of space. This is the image that modern quantum field theory has of so-called empty space. And we know that if we take this image, we don't take it as an image, we formalize this with calculations in quantum field theory, you can build a standard model of particle physics, and it works. It makes precise predictions where you have these Feynman diagrams where one particle exchanges a force particle with another and kicks it away and so on. Maybe you have seen these Feynman diagrams, and it works perfectly. But the question is, does this mean that this model of reality, of empty space, with particles, so-called virtual particles, popping in and out of existence, is this ontologically really true? And that's the question. And I say, no, these are just abstract models that we have constructed only because we know that they work. but this doesn't mean that they have any intrinsic reality in itself. It is again a fiction, an image in our conscious awareness, in our mind.
Do you think similar idea applies to the concept of time?
Yeah. So what is time? Yeah, this is also a big problem that especially modern quantum field theory that tries to unify all the forces. You know that there are four forces: the gravity and electromagnetism, which we know from our daily experience. And then there are two nuclear forces, the weak and strong force. And there is this attempt to unite them in a unique so-called super force, if you like it, this so-called theory of everything, in which in reality, even if successful, would not explain everything. That it's just a misnomer, I think. But the so-called quantum gravity theory, theories of quantum gravity. And it is a dream since the times of Einstein to find for this theory of quantum gravity. And yet, we are still there. There have been dozens of proposals. The most famous proposal is string theory. String theory, which is actually in a deep crisis, because after 40 years that they have tried to find for this general theory of quantum gravity, string theory seemed to be the best candidate, but there are several reasons to believe that it probably doesn't work. And here again, I think one of the reasons why it did not work, because we didn't think carefully enough what is space and what is time. We just gave it for granted. We are just still in this Newtonian, almost Aristotelic understanding of space and time. It's just something given out there. Well, at the end, why should we? It's so intuitive. It's in our everyday experience, this thing that we call space, and also this something that we call time. Why should we bother so much? Let's shut up and calculate. Is a mantra amongst most physicists. And I think we are seeing the consequences of this way of thinking. We didn't think carefully enough about what are we doing here. We are making a lot of calculations, but what do these calculations at the level of the conceptual foundations mean? And I think space and time are probably something that is an emergent property of reality. It is not something that it's obvious and self-given in itself. And string theory, for example, also the string theory had this idea of curved, not only curved space-time, but curled up space-time dimensions. It is a theory made of 7 plus 4 dimensions, where you have, okay, the 3 spatial dimensions. The 4th dimension is time, and then other 7 curled up dimension at the microscopic scale, with lots of kind of strange geometries, also very interesting from the mathematical point of view. But the big mistake is that we fall in this rationalistic, physicalistic conception of reality that believes that what we see is objectively true out there. And we did not understand that this idea of having a string, you see a string, just a one-dimensional object that can be also closed eventually, but you see a geometrical object well defined in space and time, and that is traveling somehow like a particle. It's no longer a particle, it's a string, but essentially we think still in a classical way. We try to drag down quantum physics, quantum field theory, again into a classical picture. And this doesn't work because we are still thinking with our purely rationalistic and objective mind, which believes that the shadows that we see out there are true as they are. And that doesn't work. And the same fits for time too. Yeah.
How do you see this unfolding? Like, if this knowledge is proven and it turns out to be accurate and it's accepted in the mainstream, what are the practical applications? How would it impact our society if it's like an accepted reality?
You mean this alternative standpoint? This, yeah. Well, first of all, as you can see also from what I'm saying now, I might seem a bit contradictory because someone might say, well, this is a guy who speaks about spirituality, but then he explains things also in a very concrete and down-to-earth technical modus, way of speaking. And I'm not against rationality and reason. I'm against the idea that rationality and reason are the ultimate tool for understanding and that the only tools to understanding reality. It is a bit an anthropocentric point of view. Let's think about the fact that if we are die-hard convinced materialist scientists, we should believe in Darwinian evolution. But then we should also accept the idea that after the emergence of mind in the evolutionary process, maybe after the Homo sapiens, who is probably only a transitional being, also in the view of Darwinian evolution, also other cognitive tools may emerge, and that mind and reason is not the last word of evolution. That's something I think most intellectuals did not make a real, did not really think this through. Because if you think this through, you understand that probably our conception of reality is that of the Homo sapiens, and which is that of the analytical reason, which is fine, but it has its place there, and you use it to doing a specific number of things. You build with that houses, you construct with that airplanes, spaceships, computers, or whatever. But when you ask more philosophical questions, you cannot stick only at that. And I think the consequence, so I'm sorry for this preamble, but now I come to the answer of your question. I think the consequence of thinking this with another way is not so much that we will do things. It's not only about doing things in another way. I say that once we think in another way, and once we learn to know ourselves, once we get into contact with something that is in us and don't look always out of us, automatically also then our doing will change automatically. I usually make this example with nature. If you see nature as just a big machine, it's all a biochemical reaction, and then there are plants, there are animals, there are humans, but at the end of the story we are just a bunch of molecules, cells, neurons, governed by the laws of physics and nothing else. You have one type of understanding of nature. If, however, you go inside and get into contact and you begin to perceive the sense of unity with nature, you don't see nature as something that is other than you. You see nature as a living being. You see nature that has a life of its own and a consciousness also of its own. It is somehow not conscious in the sense of the human being, but it has a consciousness of its own. I may also say a mind of its own, and we would not destroy it as we are doing nowadays. We would not have all these problems with the environment. We would not. You would automatically feel that what we do to nature, we are doing it to ourselves. Whereas if you see it only as a big machine, well, yes, okay, you might say, that's what I always say, it's fine to have to make research on, for example, solar energy, renewable energies, eolic energies, batteries, and to put an effort in creating new technologies for a cleaner world. I advocate for this more than anyone else. I'm 100% for this. But let's make no mistake. If we will not also gain an inner contact with nature at the soul level, so to speak, then probably the problem will continue, because the problem is not only at the technological level or at the commercial economic level. The problem, we have also a problem at a soul level. We must gain this contact with nature. So this is an example of how a different mentality, a way of understanding reality, and a way also of feeling reality, of seeing reality, of perceiving it, maybe in the beginning it's more an abstract thing, but with time going on, I'm pretty sure that this will completely change also our doing, our behavior at a very practical level. Eventually also at the economical and commercial level also.
It will change the foundation of how we look at ourselves as well as the world.
Exactly, yeah.
I've noticed that you've been also involved with Sri Aurobindo's work. I wanted to ask you, like, what attracted you to his work?
Yeah. Okay. So Sri Aurobindo is, of course, there we are in the domain of pure spirituality, but I think Sri Aurobindo is a contact point between spirituality and materiality. Because Sri Aurobindo speaks of a so-called integral yoga, and has an integral view of reality, which most scientists don't like, but also most spiritual-minded people don't like, because he tries to put together somehow spirituality with materiality, with a spiritual-minded understanding of the world, with also materialistic understanding. And that's what attracted me personally to, as a intellectual guy and scientific minded guy, to this, who has, however, also an inner spiritual longing to Sri Aurobindo. It is also his evolutionary aspect. In this yoga and this spiritual understanding of reality, he integrated the evolutionary aspect, something that I don't find not much in other spiritual teachings. There are intimations, hints here and there, also in the Buddhist tradition and the other traditions, and also non-duality and so, but not really much. And there in integral yoga and Sri Aurobindo, there's also the notion of progress. And here again, you see, it pops like a virtual particle, it pops into existence every time. Here again, we have this dichotomy between thinking materially and thinking non-materially. I don't like the word spiritual. Sometimes people think at religion or things like that. I'm not talking about that. But we have this progress of this notion of progress, which is usually only scientific progress, material progress, technological progress. Here again you see how our material reductionist, physicalist, rationalist mind prevails also among the spiritual traditions. Because this notion of progress, you don't find it there, or not. I didn't find it emphasized as I would like. And whereas in Sri Aurobindo, you have this idea of also of a spiritual progression, of a spiritual progress, not just a material progress. And that's why also people wonder, what is progress? Progress must be material and spiritual. Then it is a real progress. And that's what is lacking nowadays. Again, due to this dichotomy that I told as a main motivation. But I must say that first, initially, I fell in love with non-duality. It is now a long time ago, but when I read for the first time, everything is Brahman. Everything is the one. There's only the one without the second. For me, this was a revelation because I come from a more Christian tradition, or from this tradition which has this idea of this Abrahamic God, a God that is up there and looks at what we are doing, and if we do fine, we go to heaven. If we are sinful, we go to hell, and things like that. And I said, no, that doesn't mean nothing to me. With non-duality, it opened a world to me, because there is substantially everything is God, so to speak. I don't like to use this word God. I prefer the word divine or the self. And where you have this awakening, where you discover that you're no longer this person, this individual that never existed actually. You lose this sense of separation and realize the Vedantic one without the second, this boundless Brahman, or also as some people call it, this pure love. However, with time, I was still dissatisfied with this, because I said, okay, if there is this sort of, so to speak, mistake, which never took place, of course, of the individualization of the self with the ego, and this idea of the illusion of Maya. But why does it come into being? Why does this illusion exist at all? And the non-duality did not really answer my question. Whereas when I discovered Sri Aurobindo, one of the sentences of Sri Aurobindo that were most revealing for me was, he said, man is a transitional being. We are just one page of the book of evolution. And he introduced this evolutionary concept. And he spoke about the higher states of consciousness that go beyond mind, and which is not just a realization of the self, of the Brahman, or the realization of the lack of self, if you prefer. And he came along also with the idea that matter, that is our bodies, can be infused and transmuted by a sort of alchemic process of the spirit. And this put together a lot of things for me. Science, Darwinian evolution, spirituality. Now I had a grand vision where everything has its place, and made a lot of, suddenly there was a recognition, for example, that this Darwinian evolution, that material biological evolution of which science speaks, is the emergence of a spirit in matter. And this for me was the second revelation. After the non-dual revelation, this was the second revelation for me, and that made for me a lot of sense. Yeah, so it is a so-called divine materialism. So yeah.
I've noticed this uh, among, and I may be using incorrect words, but in non-duality, it's not uncommon to see that, like, if someone is involved into like evolutionary stories or evolutionary theories, they think that you're still looking for something, and it's not a non-dual realization. Uh, it's kind of like, if one, or at least like it gets interpreted, the interpretation turns out to be like that, that if you have a non-dual realization, means one would stop looking into the evolutionary stuff. Like it's but it can be both. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah.
So, what is your comment on that?
Well, yes, in a certain sense, I already said something about that. But I don't know. Yeah, now it's a long time that I don't follow so closely the non-dual community. I'm more on the Aubindonian track. But no, I don't want to belittle the non-dual tradition. Uh, I say only for me, Sri Aurobindo opened further doors and opened larger horizons than what gave, at least to me, the non-dual interpretation and philosophy and interpretation of reality. Um, uh, because also in integral yoga, this inner realization of the self, this realization, well, Sri Aurobindo spoke of the nirvana. He also wrote very clearly about his experience of nirvana, and it makes part of his yoga. It is the first step, not the first, but it is a step of a yoga. He used to say that where other yogas end, our yoga begins. He meant to say with that the non-dual realization is important. It makes part also of his yoga. But he's said, don't stop there. Go also beyond that. There is something else. There is a spirit which has involved itself in matter and is now emerging in nature through this process of transmutation we call evolution. Whereas if you stop only at that realization, he criticized very much, well, he does it. I think nowadays that this has changed a bit because we know nowadays it's Sri Aurobindo of the 1920s, that it's of 100 years ago. But at that time, the idea to reach some moksha, the liberation, spiritual liberation, and then go into some heaven and leave this world of pain and sufferance was very strong in the minds of people. And he criticizes this strongly. I think this has changed nowadays. You don't find many non-dual speakers saying something like that. But still, for me, there is still this disinterest for the evolutionary aspect of the spirit in itself. But I don't, as I said, I don't want to convince anyone. Everyone has his or her own path through which we can grow. I don't think that integral yoga and Sri Aurobindo is good for everyone. It's for some people it's okay, for others not. And so, but for me, this idea of a spirit that comes down into the manifestation, and this idea of this divine materialism, this spoke very much to my scientific, materialistic in a certain sense, but also spiritualistic mind and character. So it resonated a lot with me.
And what were some of his insights that really stood out for you?
Well, these that I told you, this, well, to get the real understanding. Now here is again the scientist, physicist who is speaking, who sees the things from the point of view of matter. Maybe Sri Aurobindo would not agree in saying that his yoga, the main aspect is the supramental transformation of the body. It is not. If you get there, you have to first to get there. But this fact that there is this supramental consciousness that comes into our body, into matter, transmutes the cells, awakens a spirit in the body, also in the material existence, gives a completely new perspective on mostly everything. And but to understand this really, one should has to read the Mother's Agenda, which is the agenda of the spiritual path of the spiritual partner of Sri Aurobindo. She was a French lady called Mir Alfassa, and disciples nowadays affectionately call her the mother. And in this Mother's Agenda, for I think of 13 years, she describes her transformation in her body. Only going through this agenda one can really understand what's about. But this was for me really, it's changed my life. But not because I realized this thing, because we are still far away from a supramental realization. But it answered me, it answered the questions like not only who am I, but why am I, and where am I and we all going? What is the meaning of this existence? What is the meaning of evolution? And if you go a little bit higher than the spiritual, than the analytic, reductionist, materialist mind, you can see clearly that Darwinian evolution isn't wrong. I am, in a certain sense, I am a die-hard Darwinist, but it's not the whole story. And you see this. It's almost, now they are discovering the consciousness in plants. The plants seem to have a mind, or so to speak, or an intelligence. And this was unheard of previously. Previously, we saw that this kind of sort of intelligence can only exist in animals with neurons, with the brain. Now we see it's also plants seem to have, of course, not the analytic intelligence of a human being, also not of a dog, of a cat, but it's not the same intelligence we are speaking here about, but they have some cognitive capacity. And how can this be? If every cognition arises due to our neural networks in our brain. And this comes to a surprise to many people because, again, they are still in this purely materialistic thinking. If you go a little bit beyond that, it is almost something almost self-evident. It's quite obvious that it must be so. The intelligence and consciousness is not just there in a brain. It must be somehow a bit more complicated, this thing. And well, that stood out for me, which doesn't mean that we now can become all supramental and we have new species. We are still far from that. But it gives us an ideal, a frame, a direction on which we can work on. No?
And when I compare that concept with what's happening in the technological world, especially with AI and some of the direction what's pointing for technological singularity. It seems like they are trying to reach the same state and what Sri Aurobindo is pointing towards, like trying to access that you by evolving your own consciousness. So there are some similarities between the technological AI singularity as well as human singularity. What is your take on these two, like, different approach?
So I do not want to be too insistent on this, and I don't want to preach or convince anyone. But again, in my opinion, it is again this physicalist, materialist idea, which is the ideological take for granted assumption that is leading us in a wrong direction. The purely reductionistic, physical and deterministic worldview is more or less implicit, the implicit belief system of those who predict strong AI supposedly taking over in the next years or things like that. But let us assume for a moment that consciousness, mind, are more than a complicated biochemical reaction in our skull. Then I think one can easily see how all these projections, these projects, visions, hopes, utopias, or even dystopias sometimes, based on this idea of AGI, also called strong artificial intelligence, this technological singularity, transhumanism, etc., these fall apart. They collapse. They become void. They crumble. Because if mind and consciousness cannot be recreated just by a neural network, whatever complicated it might be, then these things will not come into being. We will have continue to have the so-called weak artificial intelligence. And this will serve for a lot of purposes. We already can see this today. It's fine. But the so-called strong artificial intelligence, where we will see humanoids walking on the streets, working for us for free, and thinking and having a consciousness as a human being, and eventually even beyond that. If the physicalist standpoint is wrong, then this is not possible, even not in principle. At least not in that format that we imagine it to be nowadays. And this is not because of a lack of progress or because we don't know how to do it. It is because the background assumption, the principle in itself that stays behind this rationalistic physicalism, is wrong in the first place. But to maybe a good example, anecdote would be that to point out how, for example, still today, AI has made almost no progress in understanding meaning. A computer does not understand meaning. If you take a pocket calculator and 1 plus 1 equal 2, what we see a meaning on that. For example, as you explain it to children, take one apple, another apple, put them in the basket, and you count 1 and 2. That is the meaning of 1 plus 1 equal 2. It is about a quantity of things, of objects, and you put it in a meaningful context. A supercomputer that can make trillions of calculations per second. What is there? Something, someone, a subject, or some consciousness, or a mind that understands the meaning of what it is doing? Maybe a better example that I saw more recently, I saw that, there are these neural networks that can recognize patterns, the pattern recognition, deep learning neural networks. And this is quite impressive. They, in 99% of the cases, they recognize, you show them a cat and it gives output cat. You show them a dog, it gives output a dog. You show them a house and it gives output house. But suddenly, maybe you show him, it, it's still not conscious, I assume. You show this neural network a cup of tea, and then it tells you it is an elephant. This happens maybe seldomly, only one time on 100, over 100 times. So you say it is very effective as a pattern recognition. It's very intelligent, but it is not a strong intelligence because it is just a mechanism that works by a best fit algorithm, so to speak. And but there's nothing that understands, because if you misunderstand, if you see a cup of tea and you say that it's an elephant, it's quite obvious that you don't understand the meaning of what you are seeing. No? And that's very, you can see this also with automatic translation programs, which are also have made some progress in the last 20 years. The first that I tried out was 20 years ago. But you see, when it does not work, you can see clearly this is just a machine that does not understand what it is doing. I think that's one point, an example, how one can, and there has been no progress whatsoever in this regards. The artificial intelligence, when it comes to the meaning of things, is as stupid as 20 years ago. There's been no progress. So I'm a bit skeptic. I'm a bit skeptic that I think AI is very in fashion nowadays. But I'm afraid that this strong AI will turn out to be also a strong delusion sooner or later.
And what's your take on the simulation theory hypothesis?
Yeah. So this is also something that is obviously a very nice idea for someone who thinks that everything can be explained away in a purely rational manner and physical, materialistic, reductionistic, and mechanistic manner. But first of all, I have a problem in understanding what it is supposed to explain after all. What is it supposed, because, okay, let's suppose that we are just a simulation. The question is, who is a simulator? Who is doing this simulation? So we must suppose that there is someone else that simulates us. Okay, but what does it explain then about our existence? Why do we need this simulation hypothesis in the first place? Because if the simulation hypothesis is supposed to explain why we exist here and why there is something instead of nothing, then this fails completely, because it shifts only logically the realm in a sort of hierarchical system, the problem, but does not solve it. Because then I can also ask, if there is someone simulating the universe, is the simulator also a simulation? So it is a regress, an infinite regress. So maybe I should, I'm not an expert of this field because I didn't like it too much, so after a while I set it aside. But it's not clear to me what this is supposed to explain, since we have then this problem. And secondly, and most importantly, what is this simulation? I worked I worked a lot on simulations. I did this for my master's degree and also for my PhD, and I used to make also simulation later as a postdoc, as a researcher in university. And if we are really open and honest with ourselves, these are very, very down to earth, superficial representations of reality, and that cannot be taken for what they are. But let's also assume that there is a super hyper civilization which is able to simulate every atom of our existence and everything. But what does this mean? It is just a code running into a computer. Why should this give rise to a universe? Take, for example, the simulation of weather. You know, for the weather forecast, you can simulate what we will have the weather, I mean the meteorological weather in the next days, 48 hours, and so. And I would say they are pretty precise. Usually, I would say they make the right predictions. But the question is, does it also rain inside this supercomputer who is doing this simulation? A simulation is something very different from a recreation, from a creation of the phenomenon. Simulating a phenomenon is one thing. Recreating the phenomenon is a completely different thing. Also, if I am able to simulate every molecule of the atmosphere and simulate the weather for the next 10 years with 100% precision, I'm only simulating it. I'm not recreating it. Because in that supercomputer, nothing is raining. It's not snowing. There are not water falling in our rivers. It's just an abstraction inside a computer chip or many parallel computer chips and memories. So also here, I say, this simulation hypothesis, does this simulation also recreate besides simulate things? And rarely did I hear some further deeper thought about that. So at the end of the story, I'm skeptic also about that. I don't think if we live in a simulation, we live in the simulation of the divine mind. It is a divine mind that is simulating in itself through a cosmic mind matter, things, objects, and which through an evolutionary process or the spirit emerges in this evolutionary process and infuses and emerges and transmutes matter, and that's what we call evolution, then we have all this nice story, oh, well, not always so nice, but we have this cosmic drama unfolding. In this sense, yes, I believe that's simulation, but I think it's a completely different thing that people think when we speak about the simulation hypothesis.
Yeah, I think when it seems like when usually when we think about simulation, it more sounds like there is someone outside who is running that simulation. And you're referring to is different than from that, like it's not based on a material based simulation.
You mean that the divine simulation?
Yeah.
Yes, in the case of the divine simulation, you don't have this contradiction because it is the divine itself that simulates things in itself. So the contradiction does not arise. Well, it's not a contradiction, but the question is not answered. No? Because if God is the simulator, then I would say, is God again simulated by some super God? I don't know. You know, we are full of these theories nowadays, which are, I think, mostly hyped by the media. But most scientists, I think, also, well, I never worked in the AI environment, but I know physicists, astrophysicists, cosmologists, and particle physicists, and they speak about these things only when they speak to the media. But that's also why I spoke because I wrote my book, where I say, people, folks, let us get first the basics. Let us see what we know. And once we know something, then I had it's in 2 volumes. The first volume is a very basic, down to earth, it's technical. So once you have learned that, in the second volume, I go over also to these theories and to the speculations. But at the end of the story, most physicists are not busy with this sort of things. And rightly so, because unless there is not a real evidence, and I don't have no clue and no idea how we will ever find such an evidence for something like that. The same fits also for the multiverse theories, you know. Yeah. But I think the important thing is not that we don't, I don't want to say that we should not speak about these things. It's nice, it's okay. But we should be aware that these are wild speculations. And there are, unfortunately, also physicists out there that speak about these things sometimes as given facts and scientific facts that have been shown and proven. No, they are not. They are just wild speculations, and on which most physicists and astronomers don't work on, I think. But this does mean that they're interesting nevertheless. Yeah. We should make philosophy. I'm very for philosophizing. Yeah. It's necessary.
What is your philosophical take on quantum physics and consciousness then?
So also here, you see, there is this idea, quantum physics and consciousness. Quantum physics has proven without doubt that consciousness is created by quantum phenomenon, and the soul is a quantum phenomenon. I would say, let's be honest. If you know these things, you cannot say these things, as some people say out there. Also some professionals I see. And if you are a spiritually minded person like I am, we must be honest. Let's see what quantum physics tells us about it. Quantum physics does not tell us much about the emergence of consciousness. It tells us much more about how our mind works. That's what I told before, in the sense that I'm very in favor of an philosophical understanding of reality, which is that of so-called philosophical idealism, which is that of Kant, Schopenhauer, the German idealists, Schelling, Hegel, and these people. They had, if you read them, you may also understand better quantum physics, I think. So quantum physics tells us something about us and our mind and how we perceive the world. But about consciousness in itself, I am optimistic that it will tell us something about that too. But let's be honest, we are not there. There's nothing in quantum physics that tells you that the quantum fluctuation is a fluctuation of consciousness. In quantum field theory, we have this idea that the whole cosmos, a whole space-time and everything which is in it is just a sort of excitation of a quantum field. And we can see this quantum field as a conscious field. And I personally, I'm very sympathetic to this idea. And I would say I also believe in that. I think, yes, that's correct. This universal cosmic quantum field is an aspect of the cosmic mind, which is not the supermind. The supermind is still something which connects the transcendent with the immanent. The cosmic mind is that which expresses the mental character of the universe, and that's why mathematics works so well, because there is, in effect, a cosmic mind that works by differentiation and by, you can call it also numbers, if you wish. And that's why mathematics works so well and answers, I think, in some, to some degree, the question of Wheeler, who wondered. Wheeler was a physicist, I think a British physicist of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and who wondered why is mathematics so effective. It is so effective because at the level of the manifestation, from the supermind, the cosmic mind is the substrate of existence, of the material and space-time existence that we live in, that we call the physical universe, and it has a mental character in some sense, and that's why it works well. So I think, yes, this quantum field has something to do with this universal cosmic consciousness, but I would never tell that directly in a physics workshop. It would not be serious. It would mean it is just my own extrapolation, my inner feeling, on which we might work on, and one day we will find these connections. But this idea, yeah, there's, for example, a very popular idea is that the observer, the human observer, influences with its consciousness the outcome of an experiment in quantum physics. You don't find anything like that nowhere. There's nothing like that in physics, at least not that physics we are talking about nowadays. There is a bit more subtle problem with the so-called measurement problem, where and a sort of thought experiment called sort of experiment of Wheeler again, that is somehow, there is a discussion in this sense if eventually our conscious observation can cause the so-called collapse of the wave function. But my perception, it is something that is it is exaggerated, and you don't, in the physics that we know nowadays and that works so far, there is nothing like the consciousness of the observer causing the collapse of the wave function. Not at least in the classical sense by making a measurement and so on. There are some who discuss this, but I'm more cautious with that. I think we need something more to say that. But very frequent you see also philosophers and also, yeah, sometimes even physicists who say these things. But I think they would like to impress their audience. They take up, for example, the principle of uncertainty. You see that if you look at a particle, you cannot determine its momentum and position at the same time, which means that you are influencing with your consciousness. It's not, I would say, no serious physicist would take this as a serious interpretation. So, yes, I think there is a connection between quantum physics and consciousness. I think, for example, that the randomness, the intrinsic random character of these quantum fluctuations have to do something with consciousness, because people believe that if something is random, then it cannot have anything to do with a conscious will. I think this is, if something is random, it means only it is unpredictable. It doesn't mean anything else. So I think there is something of that sort. But let's be honest, physics as it is now doesn't tell us much about that, despite all the rumors and the misinterpretations.
Is your next book, does it talk about some of these problems? I think you're writing something on consciousness and the limits of reason and physicalism.
Yeah, but my next book will be again about, will go into this issue with hard problem of consciousness, first of all. And it will take up the mind-body problem and will ask about what can we say about going from consciousness to a new form of science. I think we need a new form of science, and if we don't get, how can I say, it's about consciousness, evolution, science, and this something that is supposed to go beyond reason. We are still not there, but I will try to give some first input in this direction. I will go also into the Western philosophy and see how Western philosophy has already reached that point, but got stuck there because it got stuck in this limit of materialism and the limit of science and reason. So it will inquire modern theories of consciousness and look inside the so-called hard problem of consciousness. We'll try to indicate a possible pathway to a new form of science, but it will be not just something that adds the science that we know today, the spirituality as we know today, and put them together and made. It will try to go beyond both and emerge in a third thing. That's what it will try to propose. So something different altogether. And it will try to explain also a bit the Aurobindonian scheme and theme will be central because it will see the human being as a transitional being in an evolutionary process of consciousness where mind, the analytical mind that we call the intellect and reason, is also only a transitional cognitive function. And yeah, and it will, the problem is that I'm stretching now myself like a spring. I'm trying to connect extreme materialism with a sort of extreme spiritualism. And this hurts a lot. And it is not easy to put all, because it needs also you to know things from physics, not only physics and science, but also in philosophy, in psychology, in spirituality, bring them together and being also very careful not to fall myself in this pseudoscience and I certainly will fall into this, but I will try to do my best. So it is a book that will present itself as a guide to a way out from our physicalist, mechanistic thinking mindset towards a spiritual understanding of reality. However, without negating science and reason, but transcending it. So it is a critique of materialism, arguing with a very scientific and also a bit technical manner in a way that I didn't find elsewhere. And that's why I'm working on this book.
I really appreciate your courage in diving into this work, because I feel like a lot of times for people from science world, I feel like it's kind of like putting your credibility on the line, even talking about these subjects, because there is so much pseudoscience about these topics out there. So it's a little bit of like an uphill. Uh,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, but that's precisely the problem, because we live in a society where people are focused only on a technical reasoning, logical mindset, or a more spiritualistic mindset. And when they focus on one side, they lose the contact with the other side. What now generally humanity needs is to progress without losing the contact of both sides. And that's why you see sometimes on one side this skeptic atheist militant movement, and on the other side this spiritual minded people who try to botch together some theories, but sometimes something very messy and not very credible comes out of it. You must try to put together the two things and throw away the dirty water, but without throwing away the baby.
do you face any
That,
challenges while working with the mainstream science, among mainstream scientists?
yeah, you mean I personally? Because I
Yeah.
had, yeah. Also, okay, so we come perhaps in this education. I didn't say much about the education thing, because you see, also about the education. See what if we see ourselves just as machines that have to learn. You have an understanding of how education should work. But let's for a moment think that we are souls in progress. Then, if you take this standpoint and you feel the necessity to express yourself, um, you will feel, at least this is my experience, I felt myself like a fish out of water in working in these environments. Because nowadays also the science has become a very big industrialized endeavor, whereas there's almost no free space for self-expression. There are deadlines. You are supposed to do this in this time, in this way, according to this criterion. And this idea of the scientist working by passion, expressing himself or herself, uh, is a naive idea that, I mean, I have gone through all the educational system, from school, college, university, as a researcher, and then also back to school as a teacher for a short time. And I got quite disillusioned about the educational system, but also the way we do research in our actual structural educational and research system. We think we badly need a structural change, and here also a different approach to science in the doing. But you get this different approach only if you are realize also this more, perhaps it sounds at first a bit abstract philosophical approach that I mentioned before. You can see this also more and more. Children are getting dissatisfied, frustrated with the system, with the schools that they develop. I have seen this also as school teacher. They develop a lot of anxiety, depression. They more and more have this ADHD disorder, no? Dyslexia or whatever other mental disorders. How should we interpret this? There are different interpretations, and I'm not saying that my interpretation is the only one. One thing is that I think in our families things are going badly wrong, and not in all, of course, but the relationship between children and their families is going downward. But this is more general. But I think that at least for a minority of children, and probably not so much a minority, there is also the soul which is asking to be allowed to manifest and develop itself, but it is not allowed to do so. There is a soul factor, an inner longing of the child's need for a self-expression, of self-development, a self-unfoldment. But it is not allowed to do so. And that's where the suffering comes from. Not for everyone, but from many, many, many children. And not only children, also in adults I see this. And we have also suicides, not only in schools, among children, but also among undergraduates and postgraduates and Ph.D. and postdocs who have killed themselves because they didn't feel themselves in the right place. But they don't understand why. They have this inner feeling that something is wrong, and they think that something is wrong with themselves. Many people are quite satisfied with the system as it is. But if someone, this is what's Sri Aurobindo calls the psychic being, this evolution in soul, the soul in evolution, in the manifestation, which is not just the soul that transmigrates from birth to birth. If this soul is not just something fixed, eternally fixed there forever, it is something that evolves from incarnation to incarnation. And at a certain point, this psychic being is no longer satisfied to just learn the lesson from someone who teaches us in a bottom-down system. And that's why I wrote this book about free progress education, because it tries, there I kept it very secular. I kept it very secular in this sense. But I was always, of course, inspired by Sri Aurobindo's approach, and in fact the free progress education is an expression that comes from there, and which is a soul-centered education in the light of an evolutionary soul concept. I'm not sure that I'm perhaps too abstract, but for me these things are very, very concrete things. Because our current educational system, and I speak not only of schools, but also of high school, of colleges, of universities, and research centers, do not allow for curiosity, for passions, for engagements, and they do not allow for a motivation from within. They use a motivation which is materially based, eventually giving you more money, or no, if you're a researcher, or for children, for motivation which is fear based. You get a reprimand, or you score badly, and then you learn more, but it is a fear-based motivation. Whereas we should try to imagine a different system which allows for an inner motivation, and which learning is also inquiry-based, on discovery, on exploration, and where the reward is not in external things, but in positive experiences. And we have to work on the strengths of the children instead of their weaknesses. And also, children should. When I say these things, people say yes. But when it comes to the doing, then things fall apart. Let me be perhaps more extreme. I would abolish completely classrooms. There should be no classroom, or at least classrooms should serve for children to meet among themselves and learn by themselves. Whereas a teacher is no longer who teaches something, but who helps them in teach themselves the things and to learn by themselves. And where their true maturity comes from learning and autonomy and working in autonomy on projects. But our thinking, as here again, is still mechanistic, rationalistic, based on a formal logical educational paradigm. And then these things will not be translated in doing. Yeah?
I think it's such an old system. It's
Yeah.
going to be very challenging to change that. It's very rigid and structural. Um,
Yeah.
I feel like the best um, they can do is like include a new course, but changing the whole foundation of it's going to be very difficult.
Um, I think we must have, first of all, courage. We must, because, you know, I will remember for all my life when I explained to a mother these things. Yeah? And I told her, well, okay, but these sort of schools, these sort of schools, in some sense, an intimation of these schools already exists. They are the so-called democratic schools, but they are not really what I mean. But they go already in this direction. But when I told, yeah, you know, that this is a concept that in the practical doing has never been put on place in reality. It will be unavoidable that for some time we will go through times of turmoil and we will have to experiment with it. Yeah? A natural reaction, which I also understand, it's understandable. I don't criticize for that. But she said, oh no, nobody will never experiment with my child. They are not animals for a laboratory. So this is an understandable reaction. Perhaps I don't have children, but if I would have children, maybe I would react in the same way. But I think there will come a time where we will have the courage to put these things also in practice, not to just have these abstract ideas. Because what I say is not really new, but in my book I made also very concrete proposals how to create a college, a university, a school, and how these could be, I don't say should, but could at least be structured also physically. For example, I said there should be no classrooms, or at least not in the sense as we intend today. Already, most people say, oh. And then there is this idea that children don't want to learn if they are not forced to learn. And this is a completely wrong idea. That comes because they have been always forced to learn, and then now they associate with the learning a negative feeling, and then therefore they don't want to. So it's obvious, but they have learned to hate learning. Whereas I contend that if we look the thing from the spiritual perspective, the whole educational issue, and see a soul-centered education, we immediately, becomes almost obvious. The human being is an animal that desires and longs to learn, to know more. It's in our intrinsic nature. But if we kill this desire and transform it in a negative conditioning and a negative feeling, then it's quite obvious that children don't want to learn. But if we create an environment, for example, without classrooms, where also teachers are helpers, but not necessarily, they can also be teachers, of course, but not necessarily teachers, where we leave, for example, children the freedom to learn what they want and then teach it to other children. And every teacher knows all too well that teaching is first of all learning. Yeah? When I taught things, it was first of all learning not only the subject in itself, which most of the things you forget usually. I mean, you make your examination in university, it's all an examination system, and then you forget it and you are happy with that. And you forget it, obviously. So you have relearned that to teach it again. But also psychologically, you learn a lot of things by teaching them. And you learn also that maybe you didn't understand really the things. Because when you teach something to others, then suddenly that is the point where you realize if you have really understood what you're teaching or not. And that's extremely important also for children. But yeah, there is this idea, no? This idea that children can also, but it is almost nowhere. It is, and then we have this problem with certificates. There's this pressure. Make your examination at that date. You have this minimum score. You must make it for that time frame, and you must learn precisely that. And then there's an examination. Yeah, you have no time left to learn other things or to develop self. First of all, your passion is killed, and secondly, you have no time to express yourself with passion. So I would abolish completely the school, not completely, no. I would keep the baby, but the structure, we must have the courage, we must be bold enough to put in place physically a structure and an environment where children and also adults and students, graduates, postgraduates can learn and express themselves. Give them this opportunity. And we don't see that. There are experiments in this sense, yeah, here and there. There have been. There is an awakening about that, on that. There are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with our educational system, and there are a lot of interesting alternatives. But still, this soul-centered concept has not come through, I think. But maybe in 10 years, who knows?
Yeah, hopefully your book will start like hopefully it will be like a seed for those kind of changes.
It is also this, in this case, it's still technical. It is still dry a bit because it explains, first of all, also why there's a crisis in science, I think. This is also connected with the educational system. A crisis in physics, for example. People don't know that, but it is now about 30 or 40 years that at least some aspects of theoretical physics are stagnating completely. There has been almost no progress. The theory with which we work today are still the theories of the 1960s, 1970s. I'm not claiming that this is the only cause for this state of affairs, but also I think it is an educational system that is stagnating, and this stagnation of the educational system reflects itself also in the stagnation of many scientific projects and ideas. And in this book, as I said, it is secular. It's, yeah, a bit here and there, slips through the spiritual thing, but I keep it. And the next book that will be more about spirituality, yes.
I look forward to discussing that book when it's out, and I also would love to dive in deeper into the building blocks of quantum physics, or whenever it's a good time for you next time. I think it's nice to go deeper into some of those topics. But I really appreciate your time today. I think this has been very informative.
Yeah, thank you, Suma. It was an honor for me.
It's really an honor for me.
Yeah.
Is there a website link where people can find out more about you?
You know, I'm not that guy who's very good with public relations. So there is a website which is named freeprogresseducation.com. freeprogresseducation.com. But it is only about free progress, and I'm still working. I would like, first of all, put on paper, yeah, everything that I feel must be put on paper, and then I will eventually think also about the, the, the broader aspect of the public relation. But in any case, if someone wants to mail me, marco.masi@gmail.com. I have no problem to give out a personal email. So if there are questions, I'm glad to answer them.
Thank you, Marco, and I'm looking forward to your new book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suma. It was a very interesting and stimulating conversation.
I also want to thank the audience for watching this video. I'll see you soon.